Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into something absolutely transformative today. We're talking about how raw, authentic testimony can literally dismantle deep-rooted trauma. Think about taking the traditional 12-step recovery model and fusing it with modern, trauma-informed clinical psychology. To do this, we're going to look at the incredible lived experience of Valerie and Todd. Now, I want you to just sit with these words for a second. At 12 years old, my mom told the judge I was a monster, and I'm going to be honest with you, I believed I was. Wow, this raw testimony from Valerie is exactly where we need to start. Because before we dive into the clinical side of recovery, we really have to ground it in visceral, lived experience. You know, when a child hears something like that from a caregiver, it doesn't just hurt their feelings. It fundamentally rewires their entire identity.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1, the power of authentic testimony. Moving from a house of horrors to profound healing.
So Valerie brings something to the table that clinical textbooks alone just can't, and that's lived experience. We call this hope realism. It's this delicate balance, right? Acknowledging the heavy, visceral reality of severe trauma, but doing it without being totally crushed by it. It pairs that really dark reality with an uplifting, non-coercive tone of profound hope. And for anyone who has been deeply wounded by life, this is an absolute game changer. In recovery, lived experience is the ultimate credential. Hope realism bridges grassroots ministry with professional psychology, making true healing actually accessible. Moving right along to part 2, inside the House of Horrors, we'll be tracing the roots of disorganized survival. To really grasp the somatic or bodily costs of Valerie's early life, we've got to look at how incredibly fast her childhood was stripped away. At just 10 years old, she hit the streets to escape her home, turning to drugs and crime literally just to survive. By 12, she was in the juvenile system, officially labeled a monster. She acted out in violence simply because she was physically beaten for expressing her feelings at home. And by the time she was 20, she was facing severe homelessness and suffering unimaginable physical neglect. We're talking about losing her toenails and even having strokes, all because she couldn't get access to basic things like a shower. Now, clinically speaking, Valerie's experience is a textbook example of what we call fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment. Basically, it's a nervous system adaptation that happens when your primary caregiver is both your source of safety and your source of absolute terror. Valerie's mother would give her Valium to calm her anxiety, right? But then she'd turn around and subject her to physical beatings, which she called a blanket dance, for expressing those exact same feelings. When the person you rely on for survival is also your biggest threat, your nervous system just fragments. It creates this incredibly chaotic, push-pull survival response. Let's just take a breather here because I want you to really reflect on this question. How does a monster label become a survival map? Think about it. When a child completely lacks the tools and the safety to appropriately express what they're feeling, they internalize the abuse. That monster identity, the violence, the acting out, none of that was a moral failing. It was literally the only map she had to navigate an incredibly dangerous world. All right, part 3, reframing the monster label. Dismantling the chains of old thinking. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how trauma-informed recovery completely flips our traditional language upside down. We used to look at destructive behaviors as character defects, a moral failing, a fixed inherent flaw that demands punishment. But now, we reframe these as tired protectors. These behaviors were actually adaptive survival strategies. They're historical nervous system responses that literally kept a person alive in a house of horrors. They don't need to be punished. They require surrender and rest. And this brings us to a foundational and honestly pretty sobering clinical insight. Predators were preyed upon. Acknowledging this cycle in recovery is absolutely crucial. Why? Because it mitigates the intense shame associated with those monster identities. It gives survivors the space to look honestly at their past acting out behaviors without losing the dignity of their core humanity. It recognizes that the harm they caused is deeply, deeply rooted in the harm they survive. So when we put this into practice, specifically during step 4 of the 12-step process, you start mapping the system instead of just listing out your flaws. You identify a pattern, say violent acting out, and you trace its trauma origin, like unpredictable punishment. Then you note the somatic cost, which is that high physical arousal in your nervous system. And finally, you look at its relational impact, how it pushes your allies away. Doing this visually externalizes the trauma. It pulls it right out of the realm of personal shame and exposes those hidden intergenerational family loops.
Which leads us to part 4, the safe witness effect, moving from internal mapping to relational repair.
This somatic healing model follows a very strict 4-part progression: safety and identity, somatic regulation, cognitive work, and finally, relational repair. You really have to notice the order here. You absolutely cannot reason with a dysregulated body. It just doesn't work. You have to calm the nervous system in steps 1 and 2 before you can ever even hope to tackle the cognitive and relational stuff in steps 3 and 4.
So the crucial point is what happens during step 5. We call this a somatic correction. It's that profound nervous system relief you get when admitting the exact nature of your wrongs to a safe witness entirely without being rejected. For someone with a fearful avoidant attachment, this is nothing short of revolutionary. It physically proves to the body that being fully seen and exposed does not mean you're going to be destroyed or abandoned.
Let's compare these two approaches as we move into steps 6 and 7. On one hand, you have forced control. This is ego-driven willpower just white-knuckling your way through to forced eradication. Honestly, it's exhausting. But the alternative is what we call wu-wei, or systemic surrender. This is the profound relief of a non-ego release. Instead of violently trying to eradicate your defects, you humbly ask for the removal of your shortcomings. You just relax those tired protective parts and let natural healing emerge. Finally, part 5, from wound to medicine, the ultimate goal of human continuity.
Listen to this incredible realization from Valerie. God didn't put me in jail. God blessed my mess when I was in jail. I mean, that is just monumental. She recognized that her rock-bottom experiences, her incarcerations, they weren't some sort of divine punishment. They were an intervention. By reframing it that way, she totally turned her narrative of trauma into a narrative of profound restoration.
And this brilliantly illustrates the concept of finding the gift in the wound. See, Valerie was brutally beaten as a child for her mouth. They called her Ralph Mouth. That was the wound. But the medicine? Today, she uses that exact same powerful, unyielding voice for truth-telling, for ministry, and for peer recovery. It just goes to show our greatest purpose so often hides directly underneath our deepest scars. The result of all this incredibly hard work is something called earned security. This is the process of actually rewiring a fearful avoidant nervous system through consistent, safe, and vulnerable presence in peer recovery. It proves that recovery isn't just about stopping bad habits, right? It's an ongoing lifestyle. It's this continuous cycle of rupture and repair that slowly but surely builds a secure base in adulthood, long, long after the childhood trauma has ended.
This entire journey culminates in human continuity. It's this beautiful transformational process where your deepest wound becomes your greatest credential, literally turning your personal mess into shared medicine. In this model, we talk a lot about the 3 hands principle. You receive the help, you hold it and integrate it, and then you reach out and pass it on to the next person. Service is the glue that solidifies the recovery process.
So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Is it possible that the very things you have been most ashamed of, the things you've kept hidden away, are actually the seeds of your greatest medicine? By looking closely at our survival adaptations through the lens of hope realism, we might just find the exact tools we need to break our chains and help others do the exact same thing. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.